Once again, welcome everyone. I thank you for having a little bit of patience this morning. We haven't had a little bit of a delay in some time on these webinars. So let us see where we are today. We have statistics that have been delayed. I'm going to take a step back first and take a look at the cause of the delayed in statistics, and talk a little bit about what the statistics mean to traders, the two takeaways from them, and then we're going to do a brief comparison of some of the statistics and some of that are missing and some of the other things that will be replaced with them. But first of all, let's take a look at the background. Okay, now this is a chart of the industrial. It's known as the INDU on Bloomberg. It's the Dow. You say, why is the Dow up here? By the way, anyone who's been to my webinars before knows if you'd like, anyone has anything to say, they'd like to interrupt a topic, just put it into chat, question, comment, consideration. Type it into chat, and I'll be glad to address it as soon as the flow of the webinar permits. But as a rule, I much prefer interruptions and feedback than a simple straight lecture. After all, I never intend these things to be speeches, but to the best that we can manage it with the, thank you very much, with more of the, I'm going to do another one of those webinars. So let me just tell you about that comment. The last webinar I did was on trade preparation, not the kind of things that I normally do, but I've decided that I think that the interest on those things is enough, and I certainly have enough experience to do that. So of the two webinars I do a month, right now we're going to do one on some sort of fundamental topic, such as today, and the next will be on trade preparation, specifically on trade preparation for a particular currency. So it'll be much more like a bit of trade analysis and technical analysis, if you will. Although I don't usually use candle charting. That has probably to do with my age more than anything else. So that'll be the next webinar. I believe it's on the 24th. So I thank you for that. So we're going to start out taking a brief look at the situation we are in, because after all, this is part of it. Then we're going to talk for a bit about the purpose, or at least the utility. I happen to like that word utility. It must be from my days in economics courses. Of statistics, what they're used for, what they're good for, and what we're going to miss. And then 3, I'll do a few comparisons and talk a bit about some of the specifics in general that we're going to miss. Right now, we have two things, and forgive me for everyone from around the world, but we're going to talk mostly about the U.S. today, U.S. statistics. 2 reasons for that. First one is the U.S. still has the largest economy in the world, and it has the world's leading central bank, the Fed, which has had more effect on the world's economy than anything else. Unfortunately, if you live in India or Brazil or any number of other countries that have been affected by the Fed's policies, you may not be very pleased with their Fed's policies or the effect that they've had and the difficulty they had for the economies. Nevertheless, this is reality, so we must deal with it. We must talk about it. The issue in the United States, as all Americans I'm sure know, because it's getting endless, breathless, hyperventilating coverage here in the United States, probably less so around the world. My guess is our friends and fellow traders around the world are looking at the United States and saying, what are they doing over there? Is this any way, as the old line goes, to run an airline? Or a railroad, I think, was the original. And it's probably difficult to understand, and I'm certainly not going to go into the political evolution of this, either historical or in particular right now. Thank you, Maud. Ms. Gilson from FX Street. One of the reasons why FX Street has been so successful over the years is Ms. Gilson. What is going on in the federal government, even in the United States, where the coverage is not terribly accurate, and reflects as much the political persuasions or the attempt to persuade by members of the media than any accurate representation of what's going on. There are two separate things, and we'll talk about them very briefly. If you're American, forgive me, or Canadian perhaps, but probably not, forgive me. You've probably had enough and heard enough about this already. But I think for the wider audience in the world, it's something that probably requires a little bit of explanation. There are two topics going on right now. The first one is the partial government shutdown. If you see it referred to as a government shutdown, that is simply not accurate. There are various figures as to how much of the government is not functioning. It's somewhere between 15 and 30%. I've seen various figures. The government, now this is, and those people are not in their office. Those functions are not being performed. Those statistics are not being released. This is not the first government shutdown of this type. There have been, I believe, 17 of them of varying lengths. This is not even remotely the longest. The longest was, I believe, 21 days and they're counting, of course, the weekends, in 1995. There is little of danger in this. All essential functions, and I believe something like 70% of the federal government is deemed essential. That's by their own definition, of course. So nothing really has changed very much. Certainly in the economic world, about the only thing that's happened is that some statistics are not being released on time. As far as plane flights, train flights, some of the bureaus are actually not producing more regulations, and in my own personal view, I don't see how that's a problem. It's a benefit. That is happening because in order for the federal government areas of departments to work, Congress actually has to specifically appropriate the money and send it and give it to those agencies. That's a function of the House of Representatives. And the Republicans in the House and the Representatives do not want to do this unless they get some concessions either on Obamacare or something else from the Democrats and the administration. So that money has already been apportioned by the Congress, but there were no specific bills. The reason there haven't been any specific bills in Congress is because for the past 5 years, there's been no specific budget. In the standard, traditional, historical way of doing budgets in this country, there are, 10 or 15, I forget how many appropriations bills that originate in the House and go to the Senate for approval, lots of horse trading, they go to the President for signatures. The President proposes a budget. The legislature then approves and changes it, sends it around through the system, and the money is appropriated. That has not happened for 5 years. There hasn't been a budget produced by the Obama administration for 5 years. So what they do every year is they just fund what they call a continuing revolution. They pile everything into one bill, not an efficient way of doing things, very little chance of examining anything. And it continues more or less the spending levels of the year before, with exceptions, of course. The spending under, that's the idea of it. The spending levels, of course, under the current administration have gone up tremendously over the past 5 years. But that's how they've done it. There have been no individual appropriations bills. And that's what they're attempting to do this year. Now, the Republicans are trying to pass individual bills to fund various parts of the government. They did actually, the only thing they agreed on is they funded or appropriated the money for. See, all of these things are funded. Congress has authorized the spending levels. But the way the government works, there has to be a specific appropriation from the funding to the department. And that's what is happening right now. That is why all of the statistics, or some of the statistics we're going to talk about, are not being produced. And there's all this yelling and screaming in the media and the Congress about this. That's a political fight. The government clearly does not shut down. Few parts of it have. The world does not end, and eventually it gets solved. Now, when you look at the industrial, the Dow, you can see some of the result of this. But in fact, there's very little. This is September 18th up here. Now, that's when the Fed said they're going to keep QE at its current $85 billion a month level. Everyone said, hey, this is great for the stock market. What has the stock market done since then? It's gone straight down. Not straight down, but it's gone down. This is October 1st, when the government, parts of it shut down. The trend hasn't changed a bit. So the trend of the Dow has very little to do with, as far as I can see, the shutdown or the debt limit, which I'll talk to in a minute. What happened, and what's likely the view here, is that the prior opinion, perhaps, support September 18th of the Dow, was that, well, if the Fed is considering tapering, then things are probably pretty good. What me worry? And now we have a different view. It is striking, I think, for the Dow, that the view at the time was, wow, this is going to be great for the Dow, but the Dow has gone steadily down since then. There have been a number of other statistics that are starting to look questionable. On top of that, I think the biggest effect is simply the logic. What does the Fed fear and the Fed know? So the topic of today about want my NFP, government shutdown, and the debt ceiling, which I'll talk about in a second, does not seem to particularly relate. Now, you could make the argument through this period here. Everybody's getting really worried about the shutdown and about the debt ceiling. I don't buy that for a minute, and I'll show you why. Remember, that's the Dow. Now we're looking at the 10-year. The most logical market out there is the bond market. And that's because the bond market has to take a horizon of anywhere from 2 to 30 years. There isn't much room for emotions, for market psychology, in that type of view. So the bond market usually gets it right. There is that line, and I forget who it was, from former President Clinton. When I come back, my next life, I want to come back to the bond market. I think that's Clinton, but I'm not sure. If anybody knows and correct me on that, please do. Same times on this chart. September 18th, Fed decided not to taper. Of course, the rates came off hard. October 1st, you notice that except for the return to 2.6 approximately, there's no trend in this chart. October 1st, when the government partially shut down, no effect whatsoever on the 10-year rate. The 10-year is a rate the 10-year Treasury, this is the generic, is the rate that many commercial rates key on, primarily mortgage rates. So it's a very closely watched statistic. There is zero sign in this chart of fear about the debt limit. Okay, now let's talk about that for a second. And then we'll talk about the use of statistics for traders. What good they actually do us, what we see in them, how we use them. The debt limit. For the past 5 years, and for many, many, many years before that as well, the United States has run a deficit. You'll sometimes hear it spoken about a primary deficit. A primary deficit means the government deficit before interest payments. I'm not sure exactly where the U.S. falls in that. We're running both a primary deficit and a deficit with interest payments included. This year, the budget year that we're talking about, the government is borrowing about a third of its necessary funds. So you look at it all different ways. That means 2/3 of the year, 9 months, end of September, the government runs out of money. Or that every single day, the government needs a third of the money for that day. But the U.S. has a limit, congressional limit, of a number, how much they're allowed to have in total debt. Right now, it's something like $16 trillion. I'm not going to talk about the reality of debt, but I'm going to talk about the actual politics of what's going on here. So the government has essentially no more money that it is allowed to borrow until Congress agrees to raise the debt limit and the president signs it. Now, that doesn't mean the government has no money. The government has billions coming in every day and every month, but it spends more. So according to the Treasury, October 17th, the government no longer has enough money to pay all of its bills that are due on the 18th. There are other figures, other calculations that have said that somewhere between the 17th and the end of the month is when the government actually runs out of money. My guess is those figures are probably more accurate than the figures coming out of the Treasury simply for political reasons. It is in the interest of the Treasury and the administration to put as much pressure on the congressional leaders as possible to get them to do what they want, which is, of course, to raise the debt limit. And the more dangerous they make the situation seem, the more pressure they're likely to bear. And there are other actions on the government's part have determined that as well. The government has shut down a number, I don't know if you see this overseas, but a number of memorials and things like that. They're actually open all the time. So it actually costs more money to shut them down than it did to keep them open. So it's not really it's a case of politics being involved with actual budgetary measures, which is completely normal, completely standard, and there's nothing unusual about it. There's no more to be blamed here than to be blamed anywhere else. So at that point, say it's the 17th. Let's just deal with that date because that's an easier way to deal with. The Treasury Department, ostensibly, supposedly, has to start choosing what to pay. There are quite a number of questions about whether federal systems, government computer systems, have this capability. Largely, they don't. The Treasury now, I believe Fed wires are what pays and the Fed is open because the Fed is funded. The Fed has its own income. So the Fed actually is not shut down. So Fed statistics are continuing to be produced and they'll be coming out. So that theoretically, the government could choose to pay whatever it wants to. This is the object that you keep hearing about federal default. There is, in my opinion, 0 chance, no, 0.00001 chance that the United States government will not make payments on its debt, both on redemptions and on interest payments. Bloomberg, the news service, calculated that between October 17th and November 7th, the federal government has both redemptions and interest payments worth about $417 billion. Remember, the numbers we're dealing with are good only and make only sense to mathematics, to mathematicians. There is more than enough money coming in to the federal government through that period to pay that debt. It is rather incomprehensible, I would close to say an impossibility, that the federal government could deliberately choose not to pay that debt. And the reasons are quite obvious. One of the most unexpected and dangerous effects of the Shearson-Lehman bankruptcy in 2008 was that the repo market, the overnight funding market, froze. The reason is because nobody then knew what debt could be put up for collateral and what debt had what debt might actually default. If that were true of treasuries, treasuries are the biggest amount of collateral put up for, this is overnight lending, largely between banks. I think corporates deliver it, participate in it as well. So what they do is they need to borrow money overnight, to make their limits on various capital adequacy things. So they put up capital adequacy rules, the Basel rules. So they put up as collateral treasuries. It's a very complicated market. It's largely a commercial market. I actually don't know that much about that market. And treasuries are the biggest component of that market as collateral. If there were any question about which treasury bills and notes were good and which were not, which had been defaulted. Remember, there are rules of all sorts of things about these types of collateral, this type of credit adequacy, and it's the rules that the banks are butting up against if treasuries had partial defaults. So it seems to me that the largest discussion about all of this is political pressure. The one thing that might raise this to the level of more than an impossibility is competence. No system in the federal government that I'm aware of was designed for partial payment, was designed to choose, was designed to prioritize. Now, because the Fed is the one that handles these payments, they go out through FedWire. I don't know where the money comes from. I assume it comes from Treasury and not from Fed. One would assume that there are contingency plans for this type of event. That is not necessarily an adequate assumption. If we look at just one current example, the government has known for 3 years that they would be rolling out the new health plan on October 1st. There has been very little competence exhibited by government planners and government execution and government programmers, or at least the ones they hired, in that particular event. So although it seems incomprehensible that the government would ever permit the type of debacle that might possibly occur from a missed federal payment, one can never be 100% sure, or maybe even 50% sure, that the programs designed to prevent that, to permit prioritization, are actually going to work, or that the decision's even been made. There's no transparency about this topic whatsoever coming out of the government. So if you're looking for something to worry about, that is what I would worry about. I don't think that there's any possibility to this, as I've said. House Republican Speaker John Boehner has said that he will not permit the government to default. And the only way to be sure that that is the case is to raise the debt limit. Looking at the 10-year chart in front of us, there is no exhibited concern in this chart in the Treasury market about a pending or a possible default. If there were the one rate that actually has been, Treasury rate that has been affected, I should have put the chart up, but I didn't think of it actually, is that the 1 month bill has seen a rise in its rates. Because worst case, judging by that change in rates, is that the government misses a payment for a couple hours or a day or two. Therefore, the monthly rate that would be affected, of course, has gone up, and no other rates have gone up. So if you're worried about default, don't be. Remember also that judging by the markets, judging by almost everything we've seen here, certainly on the market most directly concerned with the debt limit, there seems to be no consideration, no concern, and really no possibility that the U.S. is going to default on its debt. So as far as worries about that, it's preposterous. Possibility should never be concerned with probability, even when you run it through politics. So let us all keep that in mind, especially here in the United States, when we take a look at possibilities. If there's any market that would be making provision for the probable default of the U.S. on debt, it would be this credit market right here, and we would certainly be seeing this. You know, the 10-year average on the 10-year, the generic 10-year is about between 3.5% and 3.6%, I believe. If there were any possibility, realistically, that the U.S. was going to do this, that someone's going to try and make a political point on this, you would see it reflected here. And you don't, so we do not really consider that as a possibility. So let's move on to the next one. So again, just to recap, we have two questions here, and the only one which really has much effect on what we're seeing in the markets now is and if you can take a look at this, perhaps you can use, this is the Dow chart. It is the partial government shutdown. And the reason for that is some degree of economic activity, some degree, an unknown degree, is going to be affected by the partial government shutdown. I think that the great majority of economic activity in the United States is not going to be affected whatsoever. But when you combine that with the already moving equity levels because of concern of what the Fed knows and some weakening statistics, not to mention unknown. We all know, we've all heard 100 times, we all know it's true, markets don't like uncertainty. Well, two things are happening here. One is that the Fed on the 18th said, we need to keep going. The market's not as strong as we thought. And the uncertainty from that is, of course, as I said earlier, well, what does the Fed know? What do they worry about? What are they worried about? Logically, I would say right now, and this was not my opinion, I mean, one of my worst cases of market timing as far as research was the week before the 18th, I released a long piece, wrote a long piece called 6 Reasons Why the Fed Will Taper. A very good, logical presentation. However, completely wrong. The Fed did not taper. The logic there is, what does the Fed know? But in addition, the uncertainty provided by that. You know, you've had one or two of the other, especially Lacker, who has been very much against these programs, saying that, well, if the Fed could still taper. I would say now that, piece to my prior opinion, when one is wrong, and you know from trading, the most difficult and most important thing to learn is not to stand in judgment or emotional turmoil because you're wrong, simply to cut your position and start over. Therefore, my training as a trader and my experience as a trader for 15 years stands me in good stead on the intellectual side. I was wrong, and time to move on. So we will. The shutdown of the government, partial as it is, you can almost be certain will prevent any more talk or any more action on Fed tapering until the end of Mr. Bernanke's term, and that's the end of January. There's a meeting at the end of this month It's quite possible that at this rate that the government shutdown won't even have ended by then. Because you can always, the thing that I expect to happen is that the debt limit will be raised and the government shutdown will continue. There is absolutely no reason that it can't play out that way. And that's what I think will happen. So, if the government remains partially closed until the end of the month, there's zero chance, I think, because we don't know what effect or what hit this is going to have. And the Fed has already, before this happened, proved itself very cautious about the economic state going forward. The problem with all of this is the Fed is now in a box. The economy's not strong. Stronger. The Fed makes a case that things would be worse, much worse had they not done this stuff. That's all irrelevant to the argument going forward. The argument going forward is quite simple. I think the Fed was quite surprised, although God knows why they should be. Maybe there really is a different view if you have not participated in a market. I mean, I see this all the time. People will say, well, statistics came out this way. The market should have done this. It did the opposite. If you're in the market, you know why. I find it almost incomprehensible that people who have devoted their lives to participating and studying the market, even though they've never really participated as traders with the type of motivation that traders have. Traders, whether they're bond traders or credit traders or whatever they are, FX traders, equity traders, they're interested in making money, in making trading profits. That's the goal. Nothing else matters. And that provides them with a different view on what to do. Is it possible that that is not understood in the Federal Reserve boardrooms and precincts and analysis programs? I find that hard to believe, but it seems to be the case because it really does seem that the Fed was shocked, or at least surprised, this is the wrong chart, by the rise in this, where is my 10-year? But this rise right here, from May 22nd up to here. May 22nd is when the Fed first started talking about this. The whole point of this is that the Fed opinion is that the economy can't tolerate much higher rates. Well, what did they think would happen when they started talking about tapering? Quantitative easing is Fed monetary policy. And when the Fed changes policy, the bond market moves in a rush because that's where traders make the most money. So I find it hard to believe that the Fed couldn't figure that out. Okay, well, let's stop with that. What do we all do with statistics? Let's just take any choice here. Let's take retail sales. Let's take retail sales control. I got lots of statistics here. Okay, there's retail sales. What does retail sales tell us? Well, it tells us what the customers are doing out there in the market. This is a year-to-year retail sales. So you can see, now remember, retail sales are uncorrected for inflation, headline inflation. This is a headline number. This is actually the control number. Let's just look at the headline number for a second. Retail sales. Where's my retail sales? Here's retail sales year to year. Okay. So you subtract about 2% from that, and you get the actual number. And then, of course, you have to remember that the U.S. population is growing too. And if you put this in a historical context, these are pretty mediocre growth numbers. But what does this tell us? It tells us two things. Or what do we use it for? First, it gives us a judgment on the economy. But it's a judgment that changes slowly. There are no statistics that I'm aware of that come out and then suddenly everybody's got a different view of the economy. But what does happen, and this is where it becomes important, and this is where we're going to miss statistics right now, is from trading cues. If you look at the volatility in the markets, the currency markets, since October 1st, you'll notice a great withdrawal of volatility. Now, not the VIX. The VIX is a traded item. It doesn't reflect anything out there in the market except the sentiments and the trading potential of volatility. Doesn't reflect anything, any index out there, okay? So when the volatility goes up because you're getting some sort of potential, small as it may be, for the federal government to default, if you're a volatility trader, what are you going to do? You're going to buy the volatility. Because in a practical sense, in a logical sense, just the introduction of this other factor, no matter how remote, catastrophic if it did happen, but no matter how remote, means that there is more potential for volatility and for danger in the market, so you buy the VIX. But if you look at the currencies, you'll see that volatility has diminished since October 1st. One of the hardest things to do as a trader is to find, and not necessarily, well, let's put it this way. As a trader, as traders for all of us, what we look for are setups or for potential market moves. That's what we're trying to anticipate and put ourselves on the right side of that. We do that with overbought or oversold indicators. We do that with chart formations. We do that with head and shoulders. We do that with candle formations. But we also do that with statistics. And this is the place, I think, where the markets are actually going to miss the statistics more than anything else. If you look at a slew of statistics, I mean, the most popular one, of course, the one that we all do our dance around every monthly Friday. You know, 20 years ago, when I was trading, the big monthly number was the international trade numbers. No one pays the slightest bit of attention to them anymore. But it would be on a Friday afternoon, on a Friday morning at 8:30, usually after a Thursday night out. That's why you do this kind of stuff when you're young. There would be tremendous volatility around those international trade numbers. That has very much gone out of style. Now we look at non-farm payrolls. But the biggest effect of non-farm payroll for the trader is that it gives them an access to very much expected and position-sensitive volatility. Because after all, if we miss non-farm payrolls this month, it'll come back next month. And if it didn't ever come back, then the market would quickly find something else to trade on. It's only this sort of interim nebulous period where we don't have it and we're used to having it that it affects trading. As far as the overall picture of the market goes, or of the economy goes, there is no irreplaceable statistic. And in fact, there are some statistics that are just about as good as others. One thing I'll say about government statistics are, and we're going to talk about specific statistics right now, is that they tend to be, one, actual numbers, not indexes, and two, they tend to cover the entire economy. It is expensive to produce these types of statistics. For the government, it's not a profit motive. For a private organization, now ADP, automatic data processing is what it stands for, it's their business. So they're taking statistics right out of their own business. But for something like the Institute for Supply Management, I don't know if they're nonprofit. I tend to think they're not, but that's an organization, a business organization, or the conference board. They have a budget. They have to get money to pay the people to make the phone calls, to send out the emails, to send out the surveys, to collate them, to put them together, to produce everything. It costs a lot of money to do that. So that is why government statistics are invaluable. They don't have to worry about cost. They just spend the money, but they cover the entire economy. Okay, so let's take a look at some differences here. Now, what we will have, let's take a look at, where's non-farm payroll? I'll put that up here. NFP. This is our great trading number, NFP. You can see what it looks like. This is time. Now, if we didn't ever get NFP, again, no more NFP. I want my NFP. Could we use ADP? What does this chart look like? Let me see if I can get them both up here at the same time. I think I can. Here we go. Hang on. Okay, there's NFP. There's ADP. Let's look at NFP. Here we go. two charts. Just make this a little bit smaller. Whoops. Sorry, this mouse is not the greatest. It's a wireless mouse, and frankly, it would be better if it had some wires. Okay, so let's look at these two charts. Does anything look familiar here? The charts, they're not identical, but they're very similar. Both charts give you exactly the same type of information about the economy. So from a judgment point of view, there isn't really any difference, once you get used to it, in these statistics. Now, you can see that there is, that's of course not true entirely. But once you get used to the idea of a different set of statistics, you end up with the same type of judgment about the economy. The thing we would have to be concerned about here is this spike right here, which is very poorly reflected in the ADB charts. But once you assume that you're not getting non-farm payrolls anymore, the statisticians go to work and they make the charts or the information a better reflection of what's actually going on in the markets, in the economy. So from an economic point of view, there isn't very much long-term difference. The economy isn't really any different, whether it's portrayed. It isn't. It was portrayed by ADP or non-farm payrolls. Now, many people make arguments against this, of course, and in many ways I would agree with them, or a few ways anyway, in that, one, the U.S. government statistics are all-encompassing. And they take in as much as they can. Two, they are not produced with an eye toward cost, but towards accuracy. Okay, now, let's talk about some other differences between government statistics, which are what we're missing, and private statistics. One of the most common are these. Let's take a look at factory orders. Okay, factory orders, you can get this, and this is a government statistic. It's not out. This is a year-to-year percentage change, but you can actually look at the actual numbers, percentage change. An equivalent giving you the same type of information is ISM new orders, manufacturing. The problem is this is an index, and this is the biggest difference between government statistics on the whole and private statistics. Many private statistics, ISM is a private statistic, Institute for Supply Management, are indexes. They are composed of a number of different factors, and it's the change in the index that you're looking at. So this is not a pure representation in a number as the government statistic is. It gives you, again, let's look at it, a similar type of view of the economy. One thing I'm going to stop this in a second because I want to go through the actual numbers that are coming out, so we'll have a better idea of what we're talking about. But again, here, take a look at these two very differently amassed statistics. They are not dissimilar in their depiction of the economy. So there is always a substitute for statistics that are unavailable. Again, the biggest thing that we will miss are the actual numbers out of the federal government, because those are the things that economists and statisticians use. They use the raw numbers to plug them into their own models. Without the raw numbers, of course, they can't do that. So over time, there would be a huge, a building difference, because if you are estimating, the longer you have to estimate, the farther you're going to be from the correct numbers. So right now I actually have a list here of numbers that are coming out. They only have the list out through the 11th, which is this week. So today, yesterday we had consumer credit. I could show you the consumer credit numbers, but we're running out of number. Again, there are always statistics, privately available or from the government, which give a good approximation of statistics that are missing. The thing that we miss most, of course, are trading. So today we had the NFP numbers, which were off. That's the National Federation of Independent Businesses. And those numbers deteriorated, as you might well expect in this situation. The trade numbers came out. Well, the trade numbers, you can look at import-export numbers, which are coming out. You can look at import-export orders from the ISM, also from, I believe, the Fed National Activity Index, comes out of Chicago. So those are the things which you can use to replace. Again, they're not as good because they don't have the actual, many of them don't have the actual numbers as the federal government does. We also had the JOLTS numbers out today. For that, you would probably have to go to, again, the ISM numbers or the Fed National Activity numbers. Now, the hardest thing to replace for the statistics are national coverage statistics. Let me just go through the rest of these and we will wrap up. Wednesday, mortgage applications. That is coming out. I believe that's put out by the National Board of Realtors, a private organization. Wholesale real inventories is not out tomorrow, but the ISM numbers, which come out, inventory numbers, come out from the ISM, both on manufacturing and services, and the Chicago National Fed numbers. They also come out. The Fed minutes tomorrow are out. Nothing to miss. The Fed is funded by its own money. The weekly jobless claims Thursday will be out. Import prices will not be out. But again, you can get import and export orders, and I believe import and export prices from ISM and from the Fed national numbers. The Chicago Fed. Monthly federal budget, nobody looks at, people look at it, but obviously that's coming out. Biggest thing that we're not going to get this week are retail sales. And retail sales, you're going to have to stretch a little bit to take a look at it. You're not going to get numbers. Again, you can get the credit card numbers, but you're not going to be able to get any particular retail sales numbers out. Okay, let's take a look about what things that have come out that are going to have to, that we've already lost. Payroll numbers. Again, ADP is approximate, and there are a number of other employment numbers, although some of them, the good thing about ADP is it's a number, it's not an index. So let me go through the numbers that are not coming out, okay, and then we'll close up. The Bureau of Labor Statistics will not be issuing reports. They do payrolls, they do inflation, CPI, and PPI. So those we're not going to get. Now, you can get other numbers. The PCI, PCE numbers are coming out. Labor Department. Interesting that Labor Statistics, which is part of the Labor Department, will not issue, but the Labor Department itself, the overarching organization, will issue jobless claims. The Bureau of Economic Analysis, they're not going to be releasing GDP, personal income, or current account data. However, those are monthly numbers, or the GDP numbers, of course, they are quarterly, not much of an issue. Inventory numbers from EIA, the Energy Administration, they are coming out. And really, that's about it as far as issues that are not coming out. So, let me wrap up here. I thank you all for coming. The big issue we have here is really trading volatility more than actual numbers. As far as worried about the debt limit, please don't. And I thank you very much for attending, everyone. We will talk again in about 2 weeks, I think, with a trade preparation webinar. Thank you, FX Street, again, for hosting this. I'm sorry about the little breakdown in the middle, but I do know what happened to my computer, except that it froze. We will see you all again in about 2 weeks. Thank you very much. Have a good day.